friends, and welcome again to another Neo-Khuzdul lesson. As always, I am the Dwarrow Scholar, and let me welcome you to lesson number 2 in our series on the language of the dwarves of Professor Tolkien's Middle-earth. I do apologize, it has been a while for this second lesson to appear, but with some of the technical difficulties now resolved, at last, these lessons should now be coming out more regularly. For those of you that wish to find out more concerning the dwarves, please visit my blog, which is dwarrowscholar.wordpress.com, link in the lesson notes. Before we dive into this second lesson, a small yet important reminder. Khuzdul, the language of the dwarves of Middle-earth, is a secret language, spoken among dwarves and rarely spoken to non-dwarves. Hence, not to be spoken to non-dwarves. Now, seeing that we had a general introduction to Khuzdul in our previous lesson and a view of what you can expect in this series in the first lesson, I suggest we jump right in with this lesson. For those of you that haven't done lesson 1 first, please check the lesson notes below, as it's imperative that you would do that lesson first. So, in the last lesson, we got to meet 3 dwarven girls named Nara, Disi, and Tari. In this episode, we'll see these girls again, yet this time they aren't in a comfy library, but in, well, you'll soon find out where our dwarven trio has gathered this time. As in our previous lesson, we'll take a look at a selection of the dwarven alphabet, get acquainted with some new verbs, and pick up where we left off with the perfect tense. So let's visit the girls. I think they've just arrived.
Nara kulhul mamhili yadini taiku.
Tari, ama yadi dasuk adatma?
Kun nara ama yadi dasuk adatma.
Tamziri adadzini taiku.
Tamziri ma tanagi liwis hu gabil rukustaku taiku.
Ini kulhu taziri madanu?
Ama jalegilai ma dakchu ada ala kajmaktu magasharu ma ala boken ni mbu.
Ra kulhu saziria e danuksunu.
Hudush yadi rakma zuruni dasu ni taiku.
Oi, yadi ya?
Kun nana ini disi tagrainya baban azafra asti nara.
Yom baban yadi?
Ma ikshim azulo uznadul mi shaik mashaz yadi.
Tari, neyom shaik mashaz, razanir baban yadi. Miazrali das rush kidu.
Disi lo zare iski yon ada kidu.
Ja, shamukainat. Akminiast niidanku. Oh, arakuala.
Disi girinul zai ad shamzu rabarafzu. Agdidi magashulu zirakamni yanutazu.
Baslin, gabiluru usaku taiku ufam. Zajat shanzi rabarafsi raimi. Emaksunda sukastia viinara. Masagradia utaikudush.
Kuna, gurud mi rama zurul mi dubinagnug. Gujuj mi tauri.
Yadi ada kajami astu kajun tara amad kajamai de.
Akmini asti tari. Kalik. Utake kezolnia glazablag. Raya slatulia. Ala habt kulhu erekmi.
Hamd, nekmani taiku dush yababan rashaik mashaz, danuk aglaza blagzu adad?
Sadimia da khlut hamadi nesa slatya.
Ma akmini astu zirak baslin.
Well, I would say we're off to a good start of our lesson. We're yet to encounter any Shaikh Mashaz or Baban, and Nara's keeping it together despite of being scared witless, and Baslin got his sandwiches, so yeah, that's not a bad start at all. Now, before we take a closer look at each line, let's have a look at the key information of this lesson. In this lesson, we'll be introducing the imperfect form. You might remember that our first lesson we were looking at the perfect tense. As you'll recall, the perfect tense is used for dependable facts. So these usually apply to the past tense, but could easily apply to present or even future. For convenience, we often translate it with the past tense, but we must be careful to look at the meaning of every line. as the translation could be more accurate when using the present or even the future tense in English. Now, the imperfect tense refers not to incomplete action but to vividly imagined action, either because one sees it directly in front of you or imagines it as something which is playing out in your mind's eye. It has no real regard to any tense. Now, because this often describes things that are happening this very moment, it is usually translated with the present tense. But again, don't be fooled, as the imperfect in Neo-Khuzdul can refer to future and to past tense. A Dwarvish storyteller would, for instance, use this form to describe events he wants his audience to vicariously experience, regardless of whether they have happened in the distant past or were prophecies of the future. It can also be used to describe an ongoing action that is taking place at this very present. For instance, Durin taslifi, meaning Durin is now sleeping. Now, you might remember that with the perfect tense, we add something to the end of the base of the verb to form the conjugation. With the imperfect, we will add something to start and at the end of the verb base. So let's take a closer look at what is added exactly. Now, first we need to start with our base. For words with three radicals, which is what we are focusing on at present, the structure of the imperfect verb base is always the same, being consonant, consonant, vowel, consonant. We know the three-letter root or three radicals of the concept will be the consonants, such as Z-R-B for writing or Z-L-F for sleeping. Now, the vowel in this base is one of two possibilities. Either it's an A vowel or an I vowel. This comes down to remembering a verb is either an A-type verb or an I-type verb. A few examples, taking some of the roots we saw in our previous lesson. So, the concept of writing is ZRB. So those are the radicals, the root, basically, of that concept. Remember, for instance, Mazarbul, which is record or that which is written. Uses as well those three radicals. The concept of buying is a BKM. Remember, Bakama, he bought in the perfect tense. Now, in the perfect tense, these verbs had the same verb base vowels. He bought is Bakama, he wrote is Zaraba. As you can see, they both use A vowels in the perfect tense. Now, in the imperfect, the verb base for writing is Zrab, which is, as you can hear, there's an A there, so it's an A-type verb, while the imperfect verb base for buying is Bekim, so there's an E, so it's an I-type verb. Again, there's no quick trick to find out which verb uses A or which one uses I in their imperfect verb base. It's just a matter of remembering or studying it, really. As such, to write is called an AA type verb because it uses an A vowel in the perfect tense and an A vowel in the imperfect tense to form its base. Following the same logic, the verb to buy is called an AI type verb as it uses an A type verb in the perfect, vowel rather, in the perfect for its base and an I vowel in the imperfect. Before we go into too much detail, you can find an overview of all the verbs and their types in the support documents on dwarrowscholar.wordpress.com. An exact link to the documents can be found in the lesson notes. Now, back to how we form the imperfect. So, we know that our base will either have an A or an I vowel, and that the structure will always be consonant, consonant, vowel, either A or I, and consonant. So what about the conjugations for each person? So let's have a look and let's take the verb to write as an example. Remember, when using the imperfect, we are talking about events that are vividly imagined. So either because we see them happening directly in front of us, or we imagine them as something which is playing out in our mind's eye. So for the sake of example, let us say we have a dwarven hall with several rooms full of dwarves that are writing. So we see them writing before us. If we want to talk about what they are doing, we will surely use the imperfect. So in our first room, I, myself, am writing, and I want to talk about the fact that I myself am writing. So how do I form the first person singular form? Well, we've already established that our base is zrab, so Z-R-A-B, for the imperfect. Unlike the perfect tense, we will not only add something at the end of the base, but also something at the start of that base. In this case, we add a as a prefix, so at the start, and I as a suffix, so at the end, giving us azrabi, meaning I am writing, or I write in our example here. Right, moving on to our next room. In this room, Dwalin is writing, and I want to say to him that he's writing. So I would say you are writing, using the male form of you. As you can see, our base will never change. That remains Z-R-A-B, zrab, regardless of the personal form we are using. Now, in the imperfect, when we use the second person, we will always add sa as prefix, so sa, sa as prefix, and the ending will depend on the gender that we use and the number of people. So in this case, e giving us sazrabi, meaning you are writing, and you the male form. Let's say instead of Dwalin, we have Dis, sister of Thorin and mother to Filian Kili, writing a letter. In this case, we would be using the female version of you. As I said, seeing that we are still using the second person form you, we will keep the prefix sa. So sa is always used for second persons. Doesn't matter if it's singular or plural second person. So the only thing we need to change here is the suffix, so what we add at the end, to indicate that we are talking to a female. So in this case, and in all the cases for the imperfect, when we have a female form, we add ia at the end, so I-Y-A, ia, giving us sazarabia, meaning you are writing, but you the female. Let's have two female dwarves in room instead of just one. So how would we form the plural of this? You might remember that for the perfect form, we needed to add an N to the conjugation. This is no different. Here as well, we add N to the conjugation, turning it into sazrabian, meaning you, plural female, are writing. In case one of these two would be male, however, or even both would be male, we would obviously need to use the male form of the plural second person. As we saw earlier, the second form had I or I as suffix, and the plural we add an N as well, and a little exception to the rule here, because we extend the I vowel, making it into a long I or sigini, giving us sazrabin, meaning you, plural male, are writing. So those are the second person forms. Let's have a look at those again in an overview. Now let's say we want to talk about the third person forms, he, she, or them. So currently on screen we are seeing the second person forms, so these are all forms of you, whether it's you masculine, female, or singular or plural. These are all forms of you. Now let's say we're talking about he, she, or them. The only thing that we need to change to these conjugations is, instead of putting sa as a prefix, it will become ta, so ta. So tazarabi is he or it is writing, tazarabia is she is writing, tazarabin is they, the males, are writing, and tazarabian is they, the females, are writing. A very easy way to remember this, by the way, is thinking of the first letters of the word second and third. The S, like sa, used for all second person forms, and the t, like ta, used for all third person forms. So this way it's easy to remember what do I need to put in front. Now unfortunately our little mnemonic device here doesn't work for the first person, but then there's only two forms here that we need to memorize. So we already saw the first person singular, if you can recall, azrabi, I am writing. Now to form the first person plural, so for instance we are writing, we add ma as prefix, so ma, ma as prefix, while the suffix remains I, so I, giving us mazrabi, meaning we are writing. Now, this ma might sound familiar. You might remember that we add ma in the perfect form. So again, it's similar at least. It's not an extended A, but it's similar at least, so that might give you a clue that we are talking about the first person plural, so the we form. Let us recap our verb to write in the imperfect once more. I am writing azrabi. You, male singular, are writing sazrabi. You, female singular, are writing sazrabia. He is writing tazrabi. She is writing tazrabia. We are writing mazrabi. You, male plural, are writing sazrabin. You, female plural, are writing sazrabian. They are writing tazrabin, and, well, the male form to be exact, and they, the female form, are writing tazrabian. So a full overview of both the imperfect and the perfect conjugations can be found in the documents on the Dwarrow Scholar blog, document 37 to be exact, link in the lesson notes. Let's keep our overview close so that we can look at it when we need it. And let's have another listen to that first line and look at it in a bit more detail.
Nara kulhul mamhili yadini taiku.
Nara, what are we doing here in the Mayan? DC asks. When we look at the line in question, we see mamhili, a form of the verb to do. You probably already noticed it's in the imperfect form. We know the perfect tense is used for dependable facts. When we ask questions like DC is doing here, we cannot be sure of the outcome, hence it cannot be the dependable, so can't be the perfect. As such, in almost all cases, we will use the imperfect form to form questions. The verb to do uses an I vowel in its verb base, which is mhil, mahil. Seeing that we are talking about the first person, plural, which is we, what are we doing here? We add ma as prefix and I as suffix, giving us mamhili. What are we doing here? So that is what we are seeing. Looking at the other words in this line, there is kulhu, which is what, yadi, which we've seen before is here, ni, that is in, and taiku, which is the mine. Notice we usually do not translate the word the.
Tari, ama yadi dasu kadatma?
Nara replies by asking a question to her sister Tari. She asks, Tari, ama yadi dasuk adatma? Meaning, Tari, are we here to see our father? Now, when we translate the verb to be, we usually only place the personal pronoun. For instance, I'm here would translate as e yadi, meaning literally I here. Or in this case, ama yadi, we here. The personal pronoun for we, as you can see, is ama. Talking about forms of we, adad ma means our father. Father being adad, and we add ma to indicate it's our father we are talking about. We saw a few examples of that in the previous lesson too. In Khuzdul, you won't find separate words for my or your, his, her. They are always attached to the noun. We'll go into detail on all of those in future lessons, but it's good to make that clarification already at this point. As in previous lesson, you might have noticed that I'm not covering every single word in this lesson, or every single conjugation for that matter. The reason for that is that there will be future lessons that we will cover other topics that we are currently passing over or merely glancing at. So, moving on.
Kun nara, ama yadi dasuk adatma.
Tari replies by saying, yes, Nara, we are here to see our father. She says yes by saying kun. Now, this is one way of saying yes, the other way is kuna. Now, when do we use kun and when do we use kuna? Notice that Nara asks her sister Tari an open, non-negative question. So Tari gives a positive reply to that question. In such cases, we will always use kun. If Nara would have asked a negative question, for instance, ama lo gedul, are we not happy? She would have replied with kuna ama lo gedul, meaning yes, we are not happy. You see, kuna gives a positive reply to a negative question, while kun gives a positive reply to a non-negative or positive question. So, but more on that on later lessons, or even later in this lesson, that we'll see such an example. Now, this is the second time we've seen the word dasuk, so even though we won't go into detail, perhaps a brief mention about it. These are the words do and asuk, meaning to and see. Asuk, or see, is an infinitive form. We'll come across those every now and then. Nothing to worry about for now, though.
Tamziri adadzin ni taiku?
DC asks, does your father work in the mine? You might recall the conjugated verb for worked from our previous lesson, where you have worked translated as mazarsu. In the word tamziri, we see the same radicals, mzr returning, of course, but this time in the imperfect conjugation. If we were to translate this line literally, we would get, he is working, your father, in the mine. Tamziri is the third person masculine form of the verb to work in the imperfect. As we saw earlier, we add ta as a prefix and I as a suffix. The base in this case is an I type, so is mzir, so mzir. Another thing to note in this line is the form used for your. In the previous line we had adadma, meaning our father. In the previous lesson, we've also seen the use of zu and zi for the male and female version of your. This is adadzin, however, with an n at the end. Now, the pronoun zin indicates a female plural possessive. Seeing that DC is asking this about the father of two girls, being Tari and Nara, it is correct that she uses adadzin. If she would only ask this to Tari, she would have said adadzi. This is one of the great things about this language. You get loads of information you would not get in English. For instance, if you look at the translation of this line, does your father work in the mine, and you would not know anything about the situation or even the family relations of our characters, you would have no idea if this you, which is being addressed, is a male, a female, or if it's one person, or if it's more than one. All of this information is given to you in Khuzdul, which I think is pretty handy.
Tamziri ma tanagi liwis hu gabil rukustaku taiku.
Now, this line contains two conjugated imperfect verbs. There is tamziri, which we saw earlier, meaning he works, and there is tagnadi, which is translated as he delves coal. The placing of a separate ma in front of tagnadi means it turns into a negation, hence it becoming he does not delve coal. The radicals of the verb are G and D. The word gundu, meaning underground hole, is related obviously to that, as is gundabad. In the perfect form, this becomes gunuda. He has delved, using a U vowel base of gunud. This is the secondary focus for this lesson, U-type verbs in the perfect. In the last lesson, we focused mainly on verbs in the perfect that use A vowels in their base. An example was bakama, zarabmi. In this lesson, we'll see more of these U-type verbs, gunuda being a prime example. Again, an overview of all these verb types, please refer to the documentation. Now, as for the rest of this line, let's first look at the word rukusaku. In fact, it consists of three pieces, being ruk, usak, and u, literally translated as overseer of. We briefly mentioned dasuk earlier, and we said that it was to be translated as to see. So again, we see the same radicals returning, being s and k, so the extended k, return here in the word usak, being seer. So ruk usaku taiku, meaning overseer of the mine. And not just any overseer of the mine, but a great overseer, hence the gabil. Now, we might recall from the last lesson, we usually swap places of the noun and adjective. So why do we see gabil mentioned before the noun instead of after it? Should it not have been ruku saku gabil instead? Well, seeing that in this case it is a title of someone, we would place the adjective before the noun, similar to the title Gamil Zirak, as mentioned in our last lesson too. The word who indicates he, and as we do not translate to be, we get the grand overseer of the mine, or he is the grand overseer of the mine.
Inikuhu taziri madanu?
Now, in this line, we do see an imperfect form, but in a rather strange format, so to speak. The verb to ask is based on two radicals, being Z and R. So if it looks like he asks, which is Taziri, is missing a consonant, that's the reason why. It's not a three radical word, it's a two radical word. Now, for the moment, we won't go into detail at all on any two radical words, but just so you know. What is important here is the translation has favored the past tense. I mean, we could have translated it as, but why is he asking us to come? And it would have been just as correct. But seeing that we know he has asked in the past, yet we do not know why he has asked us, so we're vividly imagining him asking us, we will use the imperfect and translate it with the past tense. Another prime example that translating Neo-Khuzdul is not always cut and dry. Earlier we saw that ama is we, and now we see the word us, which is ma. Again, you surely see the similarity here with all things related to this first person plural. For instance, we add ma to the stem to indicate we are doing the action in the perfect tense. Ma as a separate word means us. Ma added as a prefix in the imperfect for the first person plural, and then ama meaning we. So we see all of these similarities, rather striking similarities. Now, in this case, the word ini is used for but, though I must point out that another word is frequently used as but as well in Khuzdul, which is ak, so ak, ak. So, but ini or ak are in fact interchangeable, so I'm sure we'll be seeing ak in future lessons as well.
Ama jalegilai ma dakchu ada ala kajmaktu magasharu ma ala bokin ni bu.
Now that's a mouthful, and no mistake about that. Ama jalegalai ma dakchum adad ala kajum aktu magashruma ala bakani bukbu. It means Mother told us to give Father this parcel after our lesson this morning in the library. Now that's quite a long line, so let's split this up in two pieces to begin with. Mother told us to give Father this parcel. We know that the word adad means father, and in this case amad is mother, so that leaves us with jalegalai madakjum. We've briefly touched on the concept of allied verbs in the first lesson. Now this is very similar to phrasal verbs or multi-word verbs you will find in many languages such as English. Examples are to cut down, to look after, to come up. Yet it's not quite the same, hence the usage of a different terminology being allied verbs. In this case we add jala, which with a verb means whole, complete, at once, to the conjugated form, which on its own would mean she speaks. This combination turns this into she told. Now, is this important at this point in time? No. Will we be reviewing it in more detail in future lessons? Most definitely. There are just too many reasons why I don't wish to dive into this at this moment, so let's just smile and wave at this one for now and move on. Notice the similarity again between the word for parcel, kajm, and the word for to give, being dakchum. Similar to the English similarity between to give and a gift. The second part of this phrase is after our lesson this morning in the library. Plenty of words here we've seen in our first lesson. Aktu is after Magashurul meaning lesson, in particular Magashurul Ma being our lesson, and then there's Allah being this. In our line here, Allah Bakan meaning this morning.
Rakulhu Saziria e Danuksunu.
And why have you asked me to come along, asks DC. Another question which will usually take the imperfect, as we see here, Saziria, which is you ask, though based on a two radical root, which we'll see in future lessons. Nonetheless, uses the same conjugations as we saw earlier when reviewing the imperfect form for three radical roots. So we add sa as prefix and iya as suffix to indicate the second person female form, singular. If you are confused by the terms two radical roots or three radical roots, a quick clarification on this. As we saw in our previous lesson, Khuzdul words are based on radicals, which are consonants placed in a specific order that are used to form all kinds of words. For instance, words that are related to the word axe will use the radicals B, R, K. Most roots, which are such combinations of radicals, are formed by 3 consonants. There is a minority, however, that is formed by 2 consonants. Though their usage is largely the same, there are some differences as to how words are formed. Hence, for the time being, ensuring we do not overcomplicate things early on, we will focus only on the 3 radical roots. Now, with this translation again, notice that we are favoring a translation in the past tense. Why have you asked me? This is because we know this action, Tari asking DC to come along, has happened in the past. Yet we don't use the perfect tense to form the Khuzdul line because the outcome of the question is not dependable. We are not sure of it. The A after Saziria is or means me, making it why have you asked me? Another word in this line I want to briefly glance at is the word sugnu. Now, some of you might know the Khuzdul word for long beards, which is sigin tarag. Sigin meaning long. As you can see, sugnu uses identical radicals as long, so it is to be expected that the word will be related to the concept of length, which it is as it means long.
Hudush yari Rama Zurumi Dasu ni Taiku.
Now, who is the standalone word used for he or it? Dush meaning dark, so literally we are saying it dark or it is dark. Notice we have used the perfect form in this line for the word zurulmi. You could translate zurulmi as I want. The conjugation of it is exactly what we've seen in our first lesson. For the first person singular, we merely add me as suffix in the perfect. Note that this verb is a U-type verb that in the perfect, as it uses U vowels to form the verb base. The negation in this line is important as well, of course. We add a separate ma in front of the verb to indicate it, so that would be ma zurulmi, I don't want. Not to be confused with the separate ma, which is the word for us. We are using the perfect form in this case because Tari is quite sure about her statement. She does not wish to be alone in the mine.
Oi, yadia.
Nara clearly seems offended by that remark. No new words here, apart perhaps from the expression oi, loosely translated as hey. Yadia is literally I hear too. Ya is a very multifunctional word in Neo-Khuzdul. Apart from the meaning to, it can mean with or even also.
Kunana inidisi tagrainya baba azafra asti nara.
Tari says, yes, sister, but DC is not afraid of spiders like you, Nara. It seems Nara has been strolling along happily in the mine until she was reminded that there were spiders in the cave. Tari believes DC likely is not afraid of spiders, but seems not sure. Hence, she will not use the perfect form here, seeing that the matter is also something that can be easily vividly imagined. The imperfect form is just right for it, as used here. The conjugated verb tagradia is the third-person singular female imperfect form of to fear. Hence, we add ta at the start. Remember to add ta for any third person in the imperfect. And we add ia to the ending as a suffix to indicate it is one female we are talking about. Our base here being grid, G-R-I-D, evidently an I-type imperfect base. The word azafr is used to say in the manner of or like. It uses the radicals ZFR, also seen in the words like likeness, model, and so forth.
Yom baban yadi.
Now it seems Nara's fear is really kicking in. The word for spiders is baban. Note the radicals BBN are also used for words like web, loom, weaver, or the verbs to weave, to spin, to enmesh, to entangle. As you can see, all clearly words that have some relation with each other.
ما إكشيم أزولو أوزندول مي شايك مشاز يادي.
So it seems spiders aren't Nara's only worry here, as there are also rats in this mine, and to make matters worse, DC seems to have the time of her life teasing her poor friend Nara. The word shaikmashaz seems a rather long word, perhaps. That's because it's made up of two different parts, a compound word, in fact. So it's shaik, being the word for craven or coward, while mashaz is a general word used for rodents. So putting this together, we get shaikmashaz, meaning coward rodents, the literal translation of the word for rats in Neo-Khuzdul. In this sentence, we also see two forms of negations, being ma and lo. As we've seen before, ma is placed before a verb when it negates its meaning. In this case, the imperative form ikshim, meaning worry. Now, we won't go into detail on the imperative form for now, yet it's important to note that regardless of the fact that our verb is in the perfect, imperfect, imperative, or any other type of tense, ma is what we will use when we wish to negate the meaning of it. The second word for negation in this line is lo, as in lo uznadulmi, meaning no bigger than. Lo is the negation used for adjectives, adverbs, comparative forms, like the word bigger here in our example. Anything that is not a verb, really.
Tari. Neyom shek mashaz. Razanir baba nyadi. Miazrali das rush kidu.
Nara says, Tari, if there are rats and big spiders here, then I want to leave now. There seems to be a clear panic setting in. The adjective zanit means big. We could have used another word here as well, which is gabil, though that generally is used to indicate great. Now, we saw a word with the same radicals in our last line. Can you remember which one? Yes. Uznadul, meaning bigger. Kidu is the word used for now. The second part of this line also features another imperfect form, this time a first-person singular form. Remember, for the first person, we take the base form, in this case zral. We add a as prefix and I as suffix, forming azrali in this case, meaning I want. Now, this is the first time we've seen the radicals ZRL used in this lesson. You might remember the word zurulmi, as in ma zurulmi dasuni taiku, meaning I don't want to be alone in the mine. Now, you might wonder, why do we use the perfect form zurulmi one time and azrali the next, when we don't see much difference in the dependability? Well, I don't want to be alone in the mine or I want to leave seem both pretty dependable after all. Well, it's important to note that he or she that speaks the line is the person that will ultimately decide what tense will be used. What may seem dependable to me or you or to us might not be so to another person's feelings at the time. Or more importantly in this case, the element of fear should not be underestimated when it comes to vividly imagining things, which after all is the key deciding factor to using the imperfect form. As we know, the imperfect tense is used to describe vividly imagined actions. I have no doubts that Nara can easily imagine herself leaving the mine, so even other verbs in the same line can influence the usage of the imperfect. Das ruj, after all, is the conjugation of the verb to leave, an infinitive form we'll see in more detail in future lessons, not azrali, which is to want, which is the one being in the imperfect. In essence, it's all about the sentiment of the speaker. What in her eye is more dominant? The fact that it is a dependable fact, or the fact that she can imagine the action vividly? Notice as well that in such situations of doubt, more passive verbs frequently favor the usage of the perfect, while more active verbs will often favor the usage of the imperfect. Something we see here as well. For instance, I don't want to be alone is a more passive action than I want to leave. Clearly the more active action in the two lines. After all, the imperfect used for vividly imagined actions, while the perfect is used for dependable facts. So when both dependability and vividly imagined would apply to a situation, consider if the sentiment of the line is more a fact or an action. Alright, now let's have a look at the next line.
Disi lo zaren. Iski yon ada kidu.
Tari says, Disi is not serious. Look, there is father now. Remember that we use lo to indicate negative adjectives, hence in this case not serious becomes lo zarin. Zarin can mean a number of things. It can mean steadfast, stern, serious, severe, or even grievous. Incidentally, the radicals zrn are also the ones seen in the word for iron. An example is that of the Ereborian translation of the Iron Hills being Urar Zirnu. The link between those two words, serious and iron, might seem a stretch at first, but think of the English being iron-willed, a steadfast or serious determined will, after all.
Shamukainat. Akminiast niidanuk. Rakuala.
Baslin says, greetings girls, thank you for coming. Oh, and who is this? And as we've seen in our previous lesson, Shamuk is our standard greeting, also used as a goodbye at times. Ainat is the plural of the word for girl, the word girl itself being night. Now, we might remember the phrases Kamansi e, you have thanked me, or Akmin ruki astu, I thank you wholeheartedly, from our previous lesson. Firstly, notice the radicals used here. Extended K, M, N, or aspired K. These are the radicals related to gratitude. As explained earlier in this lesson as well, sometimes verbs get some help from their allies, so-called allied verbs. To further clarify the meaning of a verb, Akmin ruki is just such an example. If we take away this allied verb, ruk, we are left with akmini, the form used in the imperfect for the first person singular, as we see here as well in this line spoken by Master Baslin. So what's the difference then between akmin ruki and akmini? Well, we saw in our last lesson that using akmin ruki is an extremely polite way of saying thank you. Literally, akmini means I thank, while akmin ruki means I overthank, commonly translated as I thank wholeheartedly. The element ruk either indicates that something is positioned over or above something, that the action is excessive, or that you perform the action beyond what we would be generally accepted as the norm. Now, again, we won't go into detail on the various allied verb elements, but this already should give you the general idea. So, akmini is in fact no different than any other imperfect. We have our base, in this case an I-type base, kmin. We add a as prefix and e as suffix to form our first person singular. The second element in our phrase, akmini asni, is asni, which is the form used for the plural feminine in the accusative form. Seeing that Master Baslin as addressing a group of girls, the form to use would indeed be asni. But more on the pronouns in future lessons. Lastly, ruku ala literally means and who this. As you know by now, we don't translate the verb to be.
Disi girinul, zai ad shanzu rabarafzu. Agtiti magashulu zirakamli yanu tazu.
DC, who clearly has mastered her introductions well, greets Master Baslin by saying, DC, daughter of Girin, at your service. I follow the lessons of Master Gamli with your daughters. The first part of the line is the standard introduction to a male, as seen in our first lesson. We also see a few other familiar words in the second part of this line. Magashrulu, you might remember magashrul, meaning that which is taught or a lesson. The u at the end of the word indicates of, so lesson of. You might remember that Gamli is calling DC a natuna or maiden in the first lesson. The word nuta is related to these radicals, as you can see, and it means daughters. So the singular being nata. We add zu to indicate the singular masculine form of your, making it your daughters. The conjugated verb we see here, meaning I follow, is another I-type imperfect. Gjij being the base of the verb, we add a as prefix and e as suffix, and we are good to go to form I follow being agjiji.
Baslin, gabilu rugusaku taiku ufam. Zaya chanzi rabaravsi raimi. Emaksunda sukastia dinara. Masagradia utaikudush.
If ever there was a prize for a title that is long-winded, I would dare to say that Baslin's title, being Gabil Rukusakutaiku Ufham, is a very strong contender. But knowing the skill of some dwarves for being fond of long-winded speeches, it would come as no surprise that their titles might be of the same nature. Taking a closer look at this title, though, what do we learn? Well, the title itself means Great Overseer of the North Mine. Now, firstly, how can we be sure it is indeed a title? Could he not be saying merely that he is a great overseer of the North Mine, more as a general fact than a title? Well, we can be sure it is a title based on the position of the adjective, because if he were to merely be saying that he's just one of the many great overseers of the North Mine, he would have said Rukusaku Gabil and not Gabil Rukusaku, meaning we always place our adjective after the noun unless it is a title of some sort. Now, we had mentioned earlier that Rukusakutaiku meant overseer of the mine. So the word Ufham means north. Baslin continues with a standard dwarven introduction to female, as seen in our first lesson. Then he says, I'm surprised to see you here, Nara. Are you not afraid of the dark mine? In fact, the first part, Emakshun, is literally translated as I am he who is surprised. More on this rather peculiar form in future lessons. We also see the radicals of the word fear return here. Are you not afraid? Being ma sagradia. As with any second person imperfect, we add sa as prefix, while we add ia as suffix to indicate we are talking about the singular feminine form.
Kuna, gurud mi rama zurul mi dubinagnug, gujuj mi tauri.
One thing you can say without doubt about this line is that Nara is adamant in her feelings. There is no doubt here whatsoever. These are very dependable indeed. Hence, we see three perfect forms here. All U-type, as you can see. Gurudmi, I'm afraid. Zurulmi, I want. Gujujmi, I followed. And note that we have already seen imperfect forms of all of these verbs. Remember, sagridia, azrali, agjiji. Also, the start of this line shows us an example of when we use kuna to indicate yes. This, as you can see, is an affirmative answer to a negative question, because the question was, are you not afraid? The answer is, yes, I am, kuna.
Yadi ada kajami astu kajun tara amad kajamai de.
Tari says, here, father, I give you the parcel that mother gave me. You might notice that there are quite a few words in this line that have the radicals aspired k, j, m. This root is related to giving, gifts, parcels, and the likes. Similar to the English to give and a gift, that clearly is linked there as well, as we mentioned earlier. The form used here for I give, being kajam mi, is clearly in the perfect tense. Though it could very easily have been placed in the imperfect tense, it seems Tari wants to stress that she has given the parcel, indicating that her actions are dependable, and her task of handing the parcel is done. Seeing that the action here of giving the parcel is happening before their very eyes, the imperfect could have been used too. In the end, in such situations, it's often a question of what the person is performing the action believes is more vital to their message. Is it dependability or is it vivid action? The second time we see the perfect used with kajaj mai, the form used for she. Remember, we take our base kajam and we add I to indicate the third person feminine. In this situation, using the perfect might be more widely accepted, as the action has taken place in the past. The person talking about it had witnessed it firsthand, so she is sure the action is dependable. Lastly, another word in this line I wish to briefly focus on is de. It means to me. It in fact is a contraction of the words du, meaning to, and e, meaning me. So due becomes de. There are a few of these forms in Neo-Khuzdul called a lative form. Basically, any form that uses to and a pronoun, like to you, to him, etc. A good example of such a lative form can be seen in The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, where we see Kili handle a stone with the Neo-Khuzdul inik de inscribed on it, meaning return to me.
Akmini asti tari, kalik, utake kezodnia glazablag, raya slatulia, ala habd kulhu erekni.
And now we come to it. Buslin says, "Thank you, Tari. Good." The miners stop to lunch. "And I'm hungry too. This bread is what I need." Those poor girls, and especially Nara, going through that mine with all those spiders and rats. Well, at least they didn't get to see any, so that's a relief. Now, looking at the words of interest in this line. Ekezon, a perfect form. At first glance, you might believe this is a biradical word, meaning with only two radicals, but please notice the glottal stop at the start of the word. That always counts as a radical, making it glottal stop, aspired K, Z. Those would be the radicals of that word. This conjugation thus meaning they stop. The male form, where we add on as suffix. Note that some might be females, but as long as one of the group is males, it takes the male form. Further, the word aglazablag is a compound word, made out of the words aglaz, noon, and ablag, meaning food. When we merge those two words to form a new one, and both the first and the second element have an extended vowel, which is the case, in this case an extended a, the first element will lose its extended vowel. So a glass loses its extended a, which becomes a normal a, in the compound word aglazablag. So only the last extended a, which is part of the second element, ablag, will remain. We see the same happening, by the way, in the word kazadum. There, the extended vowel in kazad, meaning dwarves, is reduced due to being paired with another word, doom, that contains an extended vowel. So more on this rule of compound words in the future.
Hamd, nekmani taiku dush yababan rashaik mashaz, danuk aglaza blagzu adad.
As one might expect, Nara is far from pleased to be brought down in the deeps of the mine merely to hand her father his lunch. Let's have a look at a few of the words we see in this line. One we saw in the previous line as well was hamt, meaning bread. Most of the other words we've seen before in previous lines. Note the adding of zu to aglazablagzu, making it your lunch, the male singular form of your. Buslin says, "You're welcome to take a slice of bread if you're hungry." Note that here the imperfect is used to stress the welcome is ongoing, happening before their very eyes. Just now I told you that hamd was bread, and now we see a word with the exact same radicals, hamadi. It means slice. Literally, it means element of bread, so slice of bread. I won't go into detail on this much now, but this elemental construction, as it's called, is not used that rarely, so you might see it every now and then. Giving you another practical example of such a construction, the word for language is aglab. Now, galabi means word or element of language. But more on this form in future lessons. We see two imperfect forms in this line, both in the singular second-person female version, sadimia, a bi-radical base dim, and saslatia, a tri-radical base. Again, we don't focus on the bi-radical forms too much at present, so that's the form of verbs based on two consonants. Yet you can see that the conjugation is always the same. We add sa as prefix to indicate we talk about the second person, and we add ia to indicate we are speaking to the one female individual. If we translate these conjugated verbs, we get sadimia, you are welcome, and saslatia, you feel hunger, as mentioned both in the female second person singular.
Ma akmini astu zirak Buslin.
This says, no thank you, Master Baslin. Now, if we were to translate this literally, it would mean, I do not thank you, Master Baslin. Perhaps a bit strange, you might think. She almost seems ungrateful for the offer. Well, in fact, though there is a way of literally saying no thank you, which would be lo akminiastu, this form is commonly used as a firm yet polite refusal. Basically, you are saying, I recognize your offer, I appreciate it, but it will not be of use for me. As I will not accept, there is no need for me to thank you for it. Another, perhaps even more polite way of refusing an offer would be ma akmini astu, na akmini astu, which would literally mean, I don't thank you, yet I thank you. In other words, no, but thanks anyway. That's it for a review of today's lesson. It's been quite the review. Now, do take into account, as with our previous lesson, though I've skipped much on purpose in this lesson, the idea is that we'll see loads of the concepts we've briefly touched upon in future lessons. This way, the learning curve isn't too steep, and you'll be able to understand and speak a bit of Neo-Khuzdul before you know it. Now, the last thing we will do in this lesson before we call it a day is to look at the Ku Zulu Alphabet again. No doubt you've noticed by now that, as with the last lesson, that I've not included any runes in translation of today's lesson. The reason for this again is to ensure that we will gradually introduce more and more runes as the lessons progress, ensuring we learn not only to understand Neo-Khuzdul but also to write it. As mentioned in our last lesson, we'll cover the entire Ku Zulu alphabet in the first 4 lessons. So today we'll be seeing the second part of that alphabet. I'll be illustrating each letter by using words seen in this lesson. So today we'll continue with the second part of 8 runes of the Kartu Urd, or as the elves call it, Angerthas Erebor. Now, I do want to point out the first 8 runes we've seen are in fact identical in both Erebor and Moria style Keert. This, however, is not the case with the 8 we'll see today, as they have in fact a different rune in Angerthas Moria. I will display this different rune, yet note that we will mainly focus on Erebor style. G, Gatu. The same sounds as in the English gaggle or gift. Note that this is one of the runes that is different in Kartu Urt and Kartu Kazadumo. An example of a word seen today with this rune is Gabil, meaning great. You'll see the Moria style listed there as well in smaller print. Gamu. This is the heavily aspired version of Gatu, a sound that is really unknown in English, mostly at least. Once again, we see a different version in the Moria style Kirt. Notice that aspired versions, meaning sounds that sound rather breathy, will usually have a rune that faces to the left. Now, it will be a bit of a challenge to give you a word that we've seen earlier that starts with or even contains this rune, as it's a rather rare occurrence, to be honest, even in Neo-Khuzdul. In fact, so rare that we have no words so far in either of our lessons that even contain this rune. An example of a word with this rune is the word for war, being azk. You clearly hear a breathy H sound at the end when you say it. Might get some getting used to pronounce this word correctly, especially considering the rune is at the end of the word. As in English, when a word ends with a separate H, the sound is usually absorbed. For instance, cheetah or savannah. You don't hear the H sound at all. Here, that is a different matter altogether. You do pronounce it clearly. In fact, if you were not to pronounce it, you might run the risk of saying different words altogether. So please note that Ghamu is indeed a similar, though different sound than Gatu. Hum. Talking about a breathy H sound, the same sound as found in English, perhaps in some words or some dialects, pronounce a bit more like a fricative, meaning that such occasions it is produced by constricting airflow through a more narrow channel at the place of articulation. So what does that mean in practice? Instead of saying you would say so you see there's more of a fricative sound there. Though I must say the latter is quite rare. You can focus on the standard pronunciation, which is identical to English. An example of such a word is in our lesson of today is hamd. Note that this rune is in fact the mirror image of the rune the glottal stop as seen in our first lesson. Again, a breathy variant, meaning that it will face to the left, as we can see here as well, because it's the mirror of the glottal stop, just facing left. I, ir. Now, sometimes this is pronounced as the English word het, though usually it's pronounced like E in the English word free. In most cases, both are considered correct, and depending on the region, you will sometimes see one favored over the other. I tend to pronounce this as ir in almost all situations instead of but as mentioned, both are considered correct. An example of such a word in our lesson today is ini, meaning but. I, siginir. The next rune is the extended version of this rune. Now, there's a bit of a background story that you should know about this rune, about Siginir. In some regions, this rune has a second usage, being the rune that points out the article in a line. In other words, it emphasizes when a word is, for instance, when it's the axe instead of an axe. So take this into account if you see this rune pop up at the start of a word where you would not expect it. Note, though, that in such cases it would be accompanied by a space marker indicating that it is in fact a separate word. Apart from its second job as an article marker, its primary job, of course, is that of vowel. In this case, it is the extended vowel version of the previous vowel we saw, being ir. The sound is the same as in the English word for heat. We take the E sound and we stretch it, making it E. An example of such a word in today's lesson would be asti, meaning you, the female form in this case, in the accusative form, as seen in akmini asti, a polite way of saying I thank you, said to a female. One last thing about this rune, at times it can be written with the rune for Y, which we'll see in future lessons, or the Yamui rune. Both are in fact considered correct forms of this. J, jatu. Spoken exactly as seen in the English word for jump or jail. One small note on this rune that might cause some confusion is that this rune in Moria style Kirt is in fact identical to the rune we saw earlier for Gatu in Ereborian style Kirt. A word we've seen in today's lesson that contains this rune is Gujujmi, meaning I have followed. Come. Spoken as in the English word kiss, it is vital that we do not make this k sound breathy in any way. It is a pure k sound, so not an aspired k, which we'll see in a minute. A word that contains this rune, seen in today's lesson, is kun, meaning yes. K, kamu. Perhaps one of the most common sounds in Khuzdul. English speakers tend to confuse this sound with its cousin come, which we saw earlier. You can find it in English in such words as king, where the k sound is pronounced more like an aspired sound, more breathy. We can find many words in our lesson today that contain this sound. An example is kajm, meaning parcel. This will do nicely, I think, for our alphabet overview for this lesson at least. In the next lesson, we'll again take a look at the next 8 runes. Now, to wrap up our lesson for today, let's have a brief review of some of the concepts and words we've seen in today's lesson. The imperfect form. Now, when will we use it? When actions are vivid, either happening in front of our eyes or vividly imagined. So it could be a storyteller telling stories about things that happened in the past. It could be something you see happening and you are describing future events described quite vividly. So all of these could apply to the perfect form. Now, how to use? Take the base form, add the prefix and the suffix depending on the person performing the action. The base itself is either an A-type or an I-type base. Now, concepts. The first concept that we've seen is kun versus kuna. These are two forms of yes. When do we use them? Well, we use kun when we express a positive answer to a positive question. And we use kuna when we express a positive answer to a negative question. For instance, to the question masagridia, meaning you are not afraid, we would respond positively by saying kuna. While to the question sagridia, you are afraid, we would respond with kun. Ma versus lo. Now these are both negations. Ma is placed before the conjugated verb to negate what is being said, while lo is placed before the adjective, noun, adverb, anything that isn't a verb really, to negate what is being said. An example, or a few examples here, masagridia being you are not afraid, and lozarin meaning not serious. Now let's recap some of the radical structures we've seen today. Inspired K, J, M. Kaj, parcel. Kajam, me, I gave. G-R-D. Sagridia, you are afraid. Gurudmi, I am afraid. Using here the imperfect and perfect forms as examples. HMD, hamd, bread. Hamadi, slice, element of bread. ZND, zanid, big. Uznadul, bigger. ZRN, zarin, serious. Zirnul, iron as in adjective. Zirin, iron as in noun. That concludes our second lesson. I hope you've enjoyed it. I can say I have. It's been great fun. Now, one thing I want to briefly mention before we close shop for today is the learning tools that have been made available. I advise everyone to have a look, first of all, at the Dwarrow Scholar website on dwarrowscholar.wordpress.com, where you'll find dozens of support documents and 2 very large dictionaries that will soon have an Excel version that you can use, because I know some people have had difficulties searching due to the size of the dictionaries. So those will allow you to review some of the content that you've seen here at your own pace. So links can be found in the show notes. In addition, if you want to practice what you've learned, you can hop on to Memrise, which is free as well. Link below in the show notes, where you'll find several exercises and memory aids to facilitate your Neo-Khuzdul learning. I also want to thank everyone that has been very generous and donated to the Dwarrow Scholar blog. Your donations make a lot of things possible. Any donation is welcomed. They enable me to invest in these video lessons, the support documents, and many other Dwarven related projects, making them even better, keeping them free for all, or for instance, getting my computer back up and running, as was the case. Again, my thanks to all that have donated. A tremendous thank you once more to Rokna, Amelie and Simone, who provided female voices heard in our scene today. We'll be hearing more from them and others in future lessons. Also, feel free to leave a comment on the YouTube page or the blog, and make sure to follow on Twitter at kstrongbeard for any updates. Drop me a mail if you want at kstrongbeard@aol.com in case you have any questions or comments. Thank you again, everyone, and Shamuk.